Hello! The most famous Cyclopean site in Europe is by far Mycenae, with its puzzling walls, capturing the imagination of not only us but also the people living in classical Greece, or Rome back then. To the extent that we keep on retelling the same stories set within those walls. Take Perseus and the Medusa, or Hercules and the 12 Labors, and even a bigger one, the War of Troy. All these tales take center stage in Mycenae, spilling their drama, fights, and romance all over the Cyclopean walls. Plus, not to forget the obvious, the mythical Cyclops themselves, famed for engineering these same walls back then. Now, realizing the protagonism these walls had, we will take a closer look at them and try to uncover the meaning behind the stories they tell. Strictly speaking, the name Cyclopean walls is only referring to the ones in Mycenae, nearby Tiryns and mostly lost ancient Argos. Those cities are the only ones classical sources said to have been built by the one-eyed giants, with all the other cases around the world being called Cyclopean only by extrapolation. Additionally, the common idea that Cyclopean walls mean big, rough boulders, as is usually understood today, is unrelated to the evidences, because in Mycenae there are four types of polygonal walls, and since the walls in Mycenae were said to have been built by the Cyclops, it is fair to call them, all the four styles, as Cyclopean. Let's check what those four types are. Number one, and the oldest, is the dry stone rough boulders that make up for most of the city foundations. These are rough, uncut and piled up, not being very work intensive to build, but quite complex to prevent collapse. The water wells, the drainage galleries, the foundations of later buildings in Mycenae, they are all made up with this type of construction. That is deceptively simple, because by not having matching shapes nor mortar to glue the stones together, they could cave in at any time. But as we can see today, they didn't crumble. Thus, the guys building it are proven, in mono hindsight, great builders. The second type, or the second oldest, are the perfectly polygonal walls with interlocking polished stones. This work is the stuff of legend because it goes against common sense to waste incredible amounts of effort and time just to build a beautiful wall. Not a lot of that fine wall survives today, but the bits that do are awesome, obviously, but also a showcase of the Cyclopean skill, contradicting that false narrative saying the unibrow giants would only build the rough older type. On 3, sometime later, we get the large square boulders of the Lion Gate. The way we know these big blocks are younger, it's because where the two walls meet, the fine polygonal type, the second one, is behind the bulky one, or the third, thus proving the big boulders are younger than the elegant polygonal wall. This order of events make us wonder why would the city walls change from one type of construction to another, something we'll try to check with the city's myth and history. Finally, at 4, we have the reconstruction made with smaller pebbles in between the carved blocks. These are the youngest and were made after the Cyclopean skill set was lost. The wall could have been rebuilt in several steps or all at once, since both the fancy polygonal of the second type and the big boulders of the Lion Gate or the third type were rebuilt at some point. We can see it was a rework by looking at the result, mixing pre-existed carved stones with smaller pebbles for stability, implying the skill or time to properly build the Cyclopean wall was, by then, lost. It is hard to determine the full age of a Cyclopean city, since there is no mortar on the walls, and the walls are set on top of the bedrock. Thus, the maximum we can do is to establish that the first stones are older than whatever was found on top of them. But how much older they are is always open for debate. This same difficulty exists in Mycenae, being mostly impossible to establish when those first stages of Cyclopean walls, made up of uncut and rough boulders, were firstly built. In these cases, our best approach is to look somewhere else, into a more important or older site, and try to fit into a broader timeline. That much we can do by consulting the oracle at Delphi. Delphi was supremely important until classical times, when a priestess called Pythia would read the fate of so many famous kings and generals. This Pythia lady would be channeling the god Apollo, after Apollo had slain a serpent that was living in the site. Not by chance, the same sanctuary had once practiced an older religion, where a priestess called Sibyl would talk for some older gods, after likely being induced into a trance by a snake bite. In Delphi, we thus have two religions and two phases in time, one younger, classical or Hellenic, and another older, pre-Hellenic, with snakes. Now, where do the Mycenaeans stay on that timeline? Were they engaged in the young religion, the Hellenic with the Pythia, or engaging with the older one, with the snake and the Sibyl? Well, for now, let's move on with the story, keeping this in mind to be sorted out later on. The next stage is when the fancy polygonal wall with tight-fitting, matching stones is built. This introduces Perseus and his incredible adventures. The events in Perseus soap opera are super messy, so I'll try and make a very short summary. Episode 1. Perseus' grandfather is cursed by a prophecy, so he hides his daughter, the princess, to try and avoid his fate. 2. The girl goes on to have a son, that's Perseus, who will come of age by killing a snake-headed hoe called the Medusa. Episode 3. Perseus eventually makes a prophecy come true by killing his grandfather and inheriting the throne of Tyrants. On top of noting that recurrent snake killing and prophecies in Delphic style, the relevant bit comes on episode 4, when Perseus becomes the king of Mycenae, not by inheritance, but after cutting a deal with his cousin to swap cities, exchanging Mycenae for Tyrants. This regardless of the population living in there. Episodes 5 and more will see the rise of the officially named the palatial culture of Mycenae, in sync with building the fanciest houses and the exquisite polygonal wall, on top of a spreading wealth gap between the ruled and the rulers. This is like a venom, promising nothing good for the future. For those into history, that's you over there. You will find this separation between the people of Mycenae and the family of Perseus eerily familiar. That could be because just recently in the 19th century AD, the ruling houses of Europe were doing about the same, splitting amongst themselves thrones and kingdoms, as if the people living in those places were nobody. Belgium and Greece got their terrible monarchies in an inbred deal made amongst ruling cousins, not unsimilar to the case of Perseus and Mycenae. A normal consequence of having a ruling class way above the populace is the excessive luxury they live in. That much is seen in the palatial culture of Mycenae, and the second oldest type of wall. The fine polygonal work is outrageously expensive to build, and if someone is decided to make their houses on the hill like that, it is because they were not sharing the burden of the common man. Hercules was a big bro, a dude that got into a lot of heavy troubles, 12 to be precise, just to make the king of Mycenae happy. Eurystheus, that's the king's name, commanded Hercules to go all around Mycenae at first and then to expand into the Mediterranean, hunting all sorts of scary beasts, including a type of a snake. There's a pattern in all those works Hercules did, and I will make a video about it if you like it. So, please like it. Now, until then, the important thing is to notice that Hercules was probably a pleb, commanded by the king of Mycenae to slay beasts in places dominated by the old gods, and sort of a snake. The reward for Hercules' success was to be considered a god, or in another version of the story, having his descendants slain Eurystheus and establishing a ruling dynasty of Mycenae, usually associated with uncertain invasion by the even more brutish tribe called the Dorians. In the end, this whole affair might not have been true, none of it, but it fits with the change in style on the walls and the big square blocks in the Lion Gate, replacing the previous fine polygonal style. The two lions on top of the Lion Gate are a symbol for a Minoan goddess that we basically know nothing about, except that they are not Cyclopean. Knossos in Crete was the capital of the Minoan culture, at least until the eruption of the volcano in Santorini. And it does not have Cyclopean masonry, overusing mortar in every construction. Likewise, the Lion Gate in Mycenae is not really polygonal, since stones are clearly squared. Although the fitting would have been better before the cheap reconstruction work done later on. Superficial knowledge of the Cyclops will say they were big brutes that built the big stone wall in Mycenae. But as we've seen, it's not the case. The big boulders are not only really polygonal, they are also younger than the fancy polygonal walls of the Perseus era. So, to me, it makes sense that the big guys carrying the big square stones were the sons of Hercules, engaging in a family tradition of powerlifting. The higher height of the Mycenaean power and the genocidal hubris of its ruling class is personalizing the character of Agamemnon. This probably fictional king was the guy that turned an extramarital affair into a world war to end all civilization, or at least to destroy Troy. There is nothing in Mycenae that you can relate to the period of the War of Troy. The walls go silent after the big blocks and the Lion Gate, and the misleadingly named Tomb of Agamemnon may not even be a tomb. But it is nevertheless a very interesting construction, featuring some impressive megaliths and superior stonework. Not being a tomb makes dating the beehive structures or tolos much harder, since there were no bodies inside. But I feel the type and quality of the stonework fits with the period after the Lion Gate. Thus, it's the peak just before the fall. Remember World War One? Of course you don't, you are way too young for that. But still, we had been told that the brutality in that war was in part a consequence of the ruling heads of Europe being disconnected from the populace and having no issue with killing millions just for the sake of a pissing contest with their inbred cousins. The War of Troy was no different. Years of relentless fighting, slaughtering the youth of the Hellenic world, just for a king to save face. When Homer told that story, the Greeks were familiar with the fate of Mycenae. Unfortunately, we do not seem to have learned the lesson, for we had a sequel to the first in World War II, and still today a lot of politicians are engaged in the preparations for a World War III, to end everything with a trilogy. Well, back to Mycenae. I believe the tolos or beehive were built after the big boulders of the Lion Gate and coincide with the city height of power, moments before the collapse. The whole city was rebuilt. That much is evident by looking at the walls, with the small pebbles placed in between the bigger blocks to ensure stability. The way we can tell it is a reconstruction is that the stones are carved but still need pebbles in the middle to keep them in place. If the people building the wall knew what they were doing, they would carve the stones in a way to dispense the pebbles. Or if they did not know how to, then carving the stones is pointless. It is work for nothing, since the pebbles would fill in the gaps anyway. The unskilled usage of pebbles amongst carved blocks is visible in the back gate at Mycenae, and also in nearby Tyrins, where all the stones seem to have been subject to cheap rework later on. Tyrins is the sister city to Mycenae. It gets dragged into all the same stories, both fictional or real. The cousins swap, the Hercules overthrown, the war in Troy, and the Bronze Age collapse to finish it all. This was when the so-called Mycenaean palatial culture, characterized by a big gap in wealth and status between the population and the ruling class, collapsed, ending poorly for everybody. As soon as the economy failed, the populace revolted, sacked the palaces, and the cities collapsed. Both Mycenae and Tyrins became a shadow of their former glory, as we can see today. The reconstruction work with the pebbles might have happened at any point during the Dark Ages that followed the Bronze Age collapse, but it is not important to know exactly when it was over. The fact is, Since Roman times, Mycenae has been nothing more than an empty tourist attraction. And tourists keep going back home without even knowing about all the stories we've just covered. Now that we've covered the episodes and the characters, we can try and make up a timeline. And for that, it's best to go backwards, because the deeper in the past we are, the more uncertain the dates will get. The final stage of the walls was the reconstruction, with the pebbles. That might have happened at any point during the Greek Dark Ages, meaning from 1200 to 600 BC. Earlier, the treasury or tomb of Agamemnon could be just 100 years older, 1300 or so, on the likely eve of the Trojan War. Before that, the Heraclidae, or the sons of Hercules, the big bodies and the big boulders with the lion gate, are yet another 1 or 2 centuries before, at 1500 or 1600 BC, in line with the volcano eruption. Perseus and his golden era is compatible with the fine polygonal walls that are older but not sure by how much. 1700 BC is slightly down the line for current academic gospel, but we can go with that. Then, finally, the bare Cyclopean work with the rough puzzle of stones composing the water wells and foundations from deep in the time of the Sibyls and the snakes is getting much closer to the 3rd millennium BC. This timeline is not incompatible with the mainstream narrative and should be a benchmark for all the other Cyclopean walls around, at least in Europe. Meaning, if we have so many sources claiming the Cyclopean walls in Mycenae were built during the Bronze Age, 2nd millennium BC, it is only reasonable to assume all other Cyclopean walls around, in Italy or Albania, are also that old, and not from 1,000 years later, as they say. We finally get to reveal who built the wall in Mycenae. And it was not Agamemnon, nor Hercules, nor Perseus, because those were kings and not stonemasons, obviously. But also because the builders were not even related to them. They were not speaking the same language, nor following the same religion. They were not even from the same ethnicity as the rulers. See, in Mycenae, we have some of the earliest writings in a familiar Greek language, using what is called the linear B alphabet. This proves the Mycenaean scribes were using a Greek Indo-European script to communicate within the ruling class their fancy affairs of state. Taxes. Linear B is used only inside the palaces in Mycenae and not to communicate with the populace outside. Sure, the populace in Mycenae would be illiterate, but that never stopped the Athenians nor the Romans to invest in outdoor advertising. So, together with that thing of making world war out of spite and swapping crowns with the cousin, the elitist use of linear B will have us conclude that the rulers were not the same people as the builders of the polygonal walls. The builders are, you got it, the older population, the Pelasgian, snake worshippers, or as I like to call them, the Cyclops. There you have it. Mycenae is the poster child for that big event happening in the Bronze Age, whereas the Indo-Europeans, a group of newcomers skilled at war, metal and writing, would first rule and then replace the older population of Europe, the old ones being some pre-writing stonemasons called Cyclopes, with probably a creepy religion and snakes. This replacement is essential to understand why polygonal masonry suddenly appears and then disappears during the precise moment where the population is still skilled at building and the ruling class is more interested in making up mega palaces up the hill for themselves. Whilst in many other places in Europe we have the stones, polygonal or cyclopean, telling us the same tale of cultural replacement during the Bronze Age, in Mycenae we also have the myths and stories giving character and context to the event. It is not a fantasy, it is our shared and nearly forgotten past. Next time we might have less storytelling and more stones, but that's then, not now. Now I hope you liked it. See you soon!